Hello, everyone, and properly welcome now to today's Story Survive program with Jerry Lindenstraus. I'm Ari Goldstein, Senior Public Programs Producer at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. Jerry is a beloved member of the museum's Speakers Bureau, whose journey took him from Germany to Shanghai and beyond. He'll share his story with us today. Jerry will speak for about 40 minutes, and then we'll present some images and conclude with about 15 minutes of audience Q&A. So please feel free to share questions for Jerry in the Zoom chat throughout the program, and we'll address as many as we can towards the end. If you enjoy hearing Jerry's story, you can read about it in more detail in his memoir, An Incredible Journey, which I'll put a link for in the Zoom chat. Without further ado, welcome, Jerry, and I'll hand things off to you. Just let me know when you want me to put the images up.
Okay, I'm ready. Okay, before I start, I want to thank Jack Klieger, the president of the museum, for making this possible. And I also want to thank you, Ari Goldstein, for arranging this talk. All right. As you know, my name is Jerry Lindenstraus. I was born in 1929 in a small town in East Prussia, Germany called Blumen. Blumen had about 30,000 inhabitants when I was born and about 200 Jews. We were completely assimilated. We celebrated the holidays, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Passover, and Hanukkah. We had a small congregation, and my grandfather even was the president of the congregation at one time. We were upper middle class. My father and his brother owned a small department store with about 20 employees. And we had a very good life up to 1933, when the Nazis came to power. The first thing the Nazis did is they made us sell the store on a forced sale, which is called Zwangsverkauf in German, at a fraction of the cost. So we left Blumen and moved to the capital of East Prussia, Königsberg. My parents got divorced, and each one remarried. There was a law in Germany at that time that if there's a divorce and it's nobody's fault, the boy goes with the father, and if it's a girl, goes with the mother. I'm sure that law doesn't exist anymore. So my mother and her new husband suddenly had to leave Germany very fast and went to Bogota, Colombia, where my mother's sister lived. Then came Kristallnacht, November 9th, 1938, which was the beginning of the end. All synagogues in Germany and Austria were burned, as well as many Jewish businesses. I already went to a Jewish school in Königsberg, which was on the basement of a synagogue. I did not see the flames. I was 9 years old. But the next day, when they took me to school, the synagogue wasn't there anymore. Now we knew we just had to get out. We had to leave Germany. At that time, the Nazis still wanted the Jews out. They wanted to make Germany Judenrein without Jews. The problem was where to go. The State Department here in the United States was quite anti-Semitic and didn't let everybody in. I personally know people who had an affidavit and a visa and couldn't get in because the German quota was too small. And so were most of the other countries in Europe. So my father figured out, and I guess many other refugees, there's one place in the world where you can go to without a visa, without any papers, as long as you had enough money for the trip, and that was Shanghai. Now, nobody knew anything about Shanghai. It was on the other side of the world. Well, it really is. There was no internet, there was no social media. Let me tell you a little bit about Shanghai in 1939. Shanghai was an international city even then. It had 5 million people. It was ruled by foreigners, but there was a French concession, which was the best part of the town. We had an international settlement where most of the Americans and British lived. And then there was Hongqiu, the Chinese working class neighborhood, which was half bombed out from the Chinese-Japanese War. Now, my father was able to secure 10 tickets on the last German ship to go to Shanghai. And we left in July 1939, 1 month before World War II started. The ship took 30 days through the Suez Canal, practically inside of the then Palestine. Now, we had to take a train ride from Königsberg to Bremerhaven, where the ship left from. And my father, I still remember my father said, be very quiet on the train, even though we have all the papers in order to leave Germany. When the police comes on board, they can arrest you. It was a very nervous ride, but we made it. Now, Shanghai, as I said, was an international city. Anything went, especially when you had money. They had opium dens, which I've seen on the street, rickshaws, coolies, professional beggars, nightclubs, whatever you want. Now, there were 2 other Jewish communities in Shanghai. There were the Russian Jews who came to Shanghai after the revolution, and they were about 4,000. And then there were the Sephardic Jews who came about 100 years from Iraq. They were in Shanghai about 100 years, and they became very rich. They owned half of the city. People like Sassoon and Kadoorie, which you might have heard of, they helped us a lot, as well as the American relief organizations like the Joint and Hires. Now, we were able to take personal effects out of Shanghai, like clothing and furniture and carpet and whatever, in a lift, in a so-called container. But we are not allowed to take money out or jewelry. That was against the law. Now, my father was able to send 500 English pounds to a cousin in England whose name was Landsberger. And he was supposed to send that money to Shanghai. With that money, we would have been probably be able to live for a year or 2. Now, 500 English pounds in 1939 was a lot of money. So when we arrived in Shanghai a month in August 1939, the first thing my father did was run to the American Express office and see if his money was there. Well, out of the 500 English pounds, 50 pounds were there, and more was supposed to come. Well, even with these 50 pounds, we were able to get a small apartment in a French concession and we moved in there and stayed for a few months. But then the money ran out and we had to move to Hongqiu, that Chinese working class neighborhood, where it was much cheaper. My father and my stepmother took a stand in an open market. They sold things people bought from Germany, like eau de cologne and perfumes and other things to try to make some money. In the winter in Shanghai, it got fairly cold and damp. My father got double pneumonia and died. I still think that part of the reason he died was that he'd never got the rest of his money, even though it was promised. He couldn't get over that the cousin would do that to him. He died in December 1939. I was 10 years old, and I said Kaddish for him in a small Russian synagogue in Hongqiu called Orel Moshe. And for several months. Now, in the meantime, between 1938 and 1941, 18,000, and I repeat, 18,000, which is a fact that a lot of people didn't know, refugees, mainly from Germany and Austria, came to Shanghai, which overwhelmed everyone. The Sephardic Jews and the relief organizations like Hayas and the Joint, they tried to help us, but it was more and more difficult. Now, then came Pearl Harbor, December 8th, 1941. The Japanese army took over all of Shanghai. American and British citizens were interned in prisoner of war camps outside of Shanghai. Now, the Nazis knew that we were there, the 18,000 refugees. And they sent a Colonel Meinsinger and two other Nazis who already were in Japan negotiating with the Japanese. They sent them to Shanghai to try to convince the Japanese, who were their allies during World War II, to get rid of us altogether and kill us. They had barges ready with holes in them where they were going to put us on and drown us. And we also, after the war, found cyanide, which they were going to use to kill us. But the Japanese, who were not really anti-Semitic, did not kill us. What they did is they established a ghetto. There were many reasons why they didn't kill us, but I don't want to go into that. That's a whole other story. Now, the ghetto was in Hongqiu, in that Chinese working class neighborhood where about 100,000 Chinese lived. The ghetto was about 30 blocks, and all 18,000 had to move in there, which was a catastrophe. You can imagine finding a room, never mind an apartment. We didn't have any money. But we did have to move in. The ghetto was without walls, and the Japanese army designated refugees to stand on the border of the ghetto so nobody could get out. There was an army major called Goya. He was the head of the ghetto. We called him the King of the Jews. He had a split personality. And when the refugees stood in line to get a pass to try to leave the ghetto, to try to get a job, he would stand on his desk, and if the refugee was small, he used to hit them And on the other hand, he went to our services and even played with the small children. Now, Horace Kadoorie, who helped us a lot, bought a building outside of the ghetto and made a school out of it for us. The school was lovingly called the Kadoorie School. Officially, it was called the Shanghai Jewish Youth Association. It had about 600 kids, about 25 teachers, all German, but they taught us in English. So we learned English pretty fast, much faster than the adults who had so many other problems. It was an excellent school. We had classes in the morning, free lunch, and after-school activities. And Friday night, we organized our own Shabbat services. I sang in a choir, and I still remember when I go to services here and hear Lechoda, that's what I used to sing on Shabbat there. Now, things got from bad to worse. We moved several times in the ghetto. One of the places we moved to, we had a half a room. My stepmother and her new husband, which were divided by a Persian carpet, which we bought. And on the other side of the room, it was another refugee family. We had no running water. We had an outhouse on the roof where we also had to cook. Now we had to buy the water from the Chinese coolies who came into the lanes and yelled, Wasser, Wasser. They spoke a few words of German. Now they had two buckets of water, one for dirty water for washing and clean water for drinking. And even though we had to boil the water, many, many refugees, thousands, got chronic diarrhea. My stepmother had it all her life until she died here in the United States. I had malaria and jaundice. We never had enough to eat, and certainly not enough medicines, very little medicines. The refugees who had nothing and were completely poor had to live in barracks in the ghetto, which we called the Heime. They also had a soup kitchen where they were able to eat. I remember people with shoes, with holes in their shoes and stuffed with newspapers. That's how poor we were. Now, my stepmother was always able to put some food on the table, so we didn't have to go to the soup kitchens. Now, altogether, in those 8-9 years that we were there, 2,000 refugees died, many from malnutrition, from other tropical diseases. Now, the refugees sold their belongings on the street to make some money and to buy food. But we also had many artists among the 18,000 who put up plays, even an opera, and then we had a newspaper, even though we never had enough food. I also was a member of the Boy Scouts, the British Boy Scouts, which was underground because they were British. Now, That's how we survived during the war. May 10th, 1945, Germany surrendered. Now, we didn't know what was going on in Europe because we didn't have any shortwave radios. And when we heard about the concentration camps and the millions of Jews that were killed, we were the lucky ones. We were able to get out. Now, we lived together with the Chinese. They used, in one place, they lived downstairs with their children and chicken, and we lived upstairs. We had very little to do with them. They were nice to us, we were nice to them. They were even worse off than we were, if that's possible. And very few refugees learned a lot of Chinese. We used Pidgin English, which was a combination of German, English, and Chinese. But we had to learn Japanese in school. They forced that on us. Japanese is a little easier than Chinese. So as I said, the war in Germany was over May 10th, 1945. But the war in the Pacific went on. We saw the American B-29s fly over Shanghai every day and bomb other cities which were occupied by the Japanese. Once they had to bomb our ghetto, and 30 refugees were killed, and many Chinese and Japanese. Now, I spoke to the pilots after the war, and they knew we were there, but they had to do it because the Japanese put war-sensitive material into the ghetto. And then the atomic bomb was dropped and the war was over. The Japanese army disappeared overnight. We left the ghetto, my friend and I, Gary, and to see what Shanghai was like after these years. And then a few days later, the American army came to Shanghai. Some of these soldiers had years of pay in their pockets, and they turned Shanghai upside down. As I told you, anything goes in Shanghai. Now, they also employed many hundreds of refugees as civilian employees, including me. I got an army bike, which I was very proud of, and they employed me as a messenger. Then I was promoted to clerk, and I still have letters of recommendations from the army officers who I worked for. We were also able to buy at the PX army stores, which was important. Things like chocolate and butter and sugar, which we didn't have for years. Now, at Hanukkah, the American Jewish soldiers who were in Shanghai made a Hanukkah card, which I still have, and which we're going to show you, which says an American dollar from an American Jewish soldier. Here it is. I have the original. Now, my mother, who was in Bogota, Colombia, knew I was in Shanghai, but there was very little communication. Very few letters went through during the war. But as soon as the war was over, she sent me a letter and a ticket and asked me to come to Bogota, Colombia. Now, I didn't want to go. I didn't remember even how my mother looked like. It was 10 years. But there were other relatives in Shanghai who said, blood is thicker than water. And I went. was one of the first few refugees who left Shanghai on an army troop ship to San Francisco, where I stayed a few weeks waiting for the visa to Colombia. And I got a good taste of life in America. I lived in Bogota for 7 years. I loved Colombia. I loved the people. I learned fluent Spanish, which was very important for me, which you'll hear later. I learned how to dance. I learned how to party. And I later recognized that that's what I needed after Shanghai, where it was so tough. Now, I want to take a moment and tell you about our most famous Shanghailanders. We called ourselves Shanghailanders. His name was Michael Blumenthal. He was also very poor in Shanghai. He came to the States, got a good education, had many positions in the State Department, and then became Secretary of the Treasury under President Carter. Now, we had many Shanghai reunions here in the United States, and he came to some of them. In the last reunion we had, he gave a very emotional speech where he said Shanghailanders tended to minimize how it was in Shanghai, that it wasn't that bad. The truth was, it was very bad, but it made us strong. Now, I promised my son that I would take him to the places where I lived in. When the Berlin Wall fell, I took him to Berlin, and then we took a private train that took the Germans and their kids to Gumbinnen to show them they was born just like I did. We were the only Jews on the train, and it was a very difficult situation. The older Germans all said we didn't know what happened in the war. They were all on the Russian front. That was all lies, and I was very uncomfortable. The kids were much nicer, and they spoke some English. Then I took them to Shanghai. In the late 1970s, you still had to go in a group. So when we got to Shanghai, I told a university student who was our guide, I want to go to Hongqiu where 18,000 refugees live. He had no idea, he didn't want to take us. You see, at that time, the Chinese government didn't publicize much that we were there. So he took us to Hongqiu. And of course, the Chinese told him all about us. I took them to the lanes where we lived. We lived in these lanes. The Chinese were still playing mahjong on the street, but there were no more beggars and no more rickshaws. They now had bicycles. In one place, a woman came out, a Chinese woman, and she said she remembered me, but I don't know if that's true. I also took him to Bogota, where I lived, introduced him to my friends. Some of them are still there. And I showed him where I lived, took him to a different city. Now, I was in Bogota 7 years, and then my mother passed away there. When she passed away, I decided to come to the United States. I got some money from restitution, Wiedergutmachung, from the German government for living in a ghetto and for lack of education. I took part of that money and bought a ticket and came to the United States in 1953 by myself. The first thing I did, went to a small town in the deep south called Monroe, Louisiana, where my stepmother and her husband went to because they had relatives there. I couldn't believe what I saw. It was still segregated. Now, my stepmother did everything possible for me to stay there with her. She introduced me to girls, etc. But I decided I want to take the rest of the money and visit other cities in the United States, which I did. And when I came to New York, the money ran out and I stayed, and I'm still here. Now, I got a job in export because I spoke Spanish, which was very easy. In 1953, not everybody spoke Spanish like they do now. I dated, I met my wife eventually. Her name was, my future wife, her name was Erika. She's from Vienna, and she came here as a refugee before the war, so she was much more Americanized. When she graduated from social work school and got a job, I started my own business in export. I had a very hard time at the beginning because I had no experience. I never went to college, but I eventually made it, and I had a warehouse in Long Island City with about 15 employees. So I got married to my wife, Erika. We were married over 50 years. I have a son and a daughter-in-law who take care of me. They're both marvelous, and two terrific grandkids. And let me see what I forgot. I think I didn't forget anything. I wanna, it's not 40 minutes yet, but anyway, I wanna finish with, and want to tell the audience what I always tell my grandkids. If it wouldn't be for Shanghai, I wouldn't be here, and neither would they. Thank you.
Gary, thank you so much for sharing your story with us. I want to invite everyone in the audience to submit questions and comments in the Zoom chat, and we'll get to them in a moment. But before we do, Jerry, I'm going to put up some of the photos that we went over, and it would be wonderful if you could tell us what's in them.
Right. You're going to put up the photos? Yeah.
Yeah, can you see?
That's on the left, the two-story building is the house in Blumen where I was born, where my father was born, and where my grandfather was born, and still stands. The Russian, when I went there with my son, he took that picture, and the Russians asked us to come in, but I didn't go in because I didn't remember. And the house on the corner was the department store, and it says Lindenstraus on the right corner there, but that was bombed out. That's a party on the ship, on the German ship. We had to buy first-class tickets round trip, but of course we never went back. And everybody is on there but me because it was an evening party. My father, my stepmother, my uncle, and my aunt, all the 10 people who got out with me. That's the swimming pool on the ship. Now, swimming pool nowadays is no big deal, but by then, and I'm in the water there. But in 1939, it was a sensation to have a ship with a pool.
And I guess you were 10 years old in this picture, right?
Yeah, I was 10 years old. That's the final picture, the goodbye picture in Shanghai, where I am with my stepmother Lily and her husband just before I left to go to Colombia. I remember it well. That was my stepmother's sister and brother-in-law's cat in Shanghai. That's me and my stepmother. It's funny story. Her name was Lily, and my mother's name was also Lily. So I had two Lilies in my life. That's me in the middle with three girls who we tried to date, but they always wanted older boys. And one of them, the one on the left, I'm still in touch with here in New York.
And Jerry, some of these captions say Gerd Lindenstraus and some say Gerald. So did your name change when you moved to Shanghai?
Well, my original name in Germany was Gerd, G-E-R-D. And I still had that on my German passport. Then in Shanghai it was changed to Jerry. And here it's also Jerry, but my official name here is Gerald. So I have three different names. I always get into trouble.
Well, we all know you as Jerry.
Yeah, Jerry. That's my Chinese identification card. Everything is in Chinese, except if you can read upside down, it says Gerd Lindenstraus in letters. I have I don't know. I think you have the original.
Yeah, all these images were donated by Jerry to the museum's collection. So these are digital productions. And Jerry, my understanding is that the yellow stripe in the upper right-hand corner here indicates that you're Jewish.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you can see him on top. Well, we were Jewish refugees, and we were stateless because the German consulate in Shanghai made us stateless, so we didn't have any nationality. That's a that's a New Year's card I made in Shanghai. The year was 5104. I don't remember exactly what year that was, but I must have been pretty young yet. It's a New Year's card I made. See, I didn't remember I had that. That's the bar mitzvah speech. And it's in German, and I somehow remember very little from the bar mitzvah.
Our records show that your Rosh Hashanah drawing was from 1940, shortly after you arrived in Shanghai, and your bar mitzvah speech was from 1942.
Right. Yeah. That's the Boy Scouts card that I was a member of the 13th group, the Boy Scouts.
I think this is right.
Which was underground.
And it lists your present address here. It says 805/24 East Seward Road, Shanghai.
Yeah, 805 Seward Road. Now, we lived in the lanes, and I think it said the house number 2 there, right? 805 what?
24.
Right. If I may, I want to tell you one other thing that I forgot.
Please.
As I said, the Chinese government, when I first went back, didn't publicize that we existed. But many years later, they changed their mind, and suddenly they decided they are the ones who saved us, which wasn't exactly true either, because the Chinese at that time were worse off than we were. But they built a museum in Shanghai for us in the ghetto called the Shanghai Jewish Refugee Museum. And they invited me to go there about 11 years ago. There's a picture of me in front of the museum. Now, that little Russian synagogue where I said Kaddish for my father and where was bar mitzvah was made, part of it was made part of the museum. And I stood on the pulpit on the bima of that museum and gave a speech to Chinese university students in German with simultaneous translation to Chinese. And they grilled me to find out how it was in Shanghai. And that was very, very emotional for me, and I'll never forget it.
Wow. When did you say that visit was?
11 years ago.
Hmm.
That was the second time I went back. And Shanghai was unrecognizable.
So Jerry, that's the end of the images. So let me ask you some questions from the audience now about your story.
Yes.
There's a couple questions about what happened to your family members who stayed in Germany, that beyond the 10 that came on the ship with you.
Well, all 10 family members were on the ship with us. Nobody I really remember stayed in Germany. There was another brother who very early went to Berlin, but I'm pretty sure he died before the Nazis came. So, I mean, I don't know anybody personally, no family members who died in the Holocaust.
Wow, you're very lucky.
Very lucky. I know many others who got out, but you know, but I'm lucky that way.
Now, what happened to the cousins in London who never sent the rest of the money to your father?
Well, of course, once the Japanese took over, there was no more communication. My father sent many cables, but after the war, my stepmother even hired a lawyer, and we could not locate him. What we think is he disappeared. He might have been killed during the bombardments in London. We tried for years, and he was never found. And the rest of the money was lost.
Wow.
Yeah.
You know, do you remember what the name was of the ship that took you to Shanghai?
Yes, of course. It was the Scharnhaus. Not only do I remember the ship, I have the passenger list and I have the menus still.
What did they serve? Chinese food or German food?
German food, of course. You know, the North German Lloyd, the Steams company, ironically, once was owned by a Jew. Yeah. But that, you know, they had, it was confiscated just like everything else.
Now, Jerry, your dad died in December 1939. Where was he buried? Was there a Jewish cemetery in Shanghai?
Well, they made a Jewish cemetery. It was on the Baikal Road, and when after the war was over and most of the refugees left and the Cultural Revolution started, the cemeteries were completely desecrated. The tombstones were turned over during the Cultural Revolution. Now, the last few years, there's a rabbi in Shanghai who came from Israel who found some of these tombstones, but not my father's, but they're still looking.
Wow, he must be there.
Yeah, that's an amazing thing, right? But I have a photo of his tombstone, which my stepmother took.
Jerry, there's some people in the audience who have family that were also in Shanghai. Do you remember Herman Selig or David Schulman?
David what?
They're all part of this question was about the Schulman family, but I guess if there were 18,000 people, it must have, it must have been a lot of strangers.
Well, you know, I really only remember the people who were my age or who were in school with me. You know, there were 18,000 people there. I don't recall that name. Were they from Germany?
I'm not sure, but so if people have connections to the Shanghai story, what are there still reunions, or do you suggest that everybody go visit the refugee museum? What's the best way to stay connected?
The what? I'm sorry, I didn't get that.
Are there still reunions of the Shanghai landers?
The letters?
No, Jerry, are there still reunions that take place of the people that were in Shanghai together?
In Shanghai?
Let me ask you, I'll move on to another question. You worked at a silk factory, I believe. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Where I worked in Shanghai?
Yeah, you were at a silk factory, right?
Right. I quit high school, the Kadoorie school, a few months before I was supposed to graduate because I stopped studying. And I got this job at the silk factory owned by Russian Jews. And they took the raw silk and eventually dyed it, and it was actually a weaving factory, and I even learned how to weave on these machines, and I had that job until the American Army came and we got the jobs as civilian employees. I immediately quit that job in the weaving factory. I used to no, actually that job was before the end of the war, before the Americans came.
Did you have many interactions with local Chinese residents when you lived there?
Connections?
Yeah, to Chinese people outside of the Jewish community in Shanghai.
Well, I mean, we lived with them in the same houses. They were nice to us. We were nice to them. It was a language problem, you know. I mean, it was very difficult to communicate. They learned a little German. We spoke Pidgin English, which was a combination of German, English, and Chinese. Very few refugees really learned fluent Chinese, and even fewer refugees married Chinese women or vice versa. There were a few cases. As a matter of fact, I have a book by one of the refugees who married a Chinese woman. But, you know, the Chinese were even worse off than we were, if that was possible, you know. We were together with them. There were 100,000 refugees. I mean, 100,000 Chinese in the ghetto. Besides that, you can imagine how densely populated that was.
What about relations between the different Jewish communities in Shanghai? There were Sephardic Jews, Russian Jews, German and Austrian immigrants. Did everyone get along?
Well, neither the Russian Jews nor the Sephardic Jews had to go into the ghetto. The Russian Jews were free because Russia was not at war with the Japanese until the last few months of the war. So there were Russian Jews in the ghetto. They used to have small businesses and there were some connections. But the Sephardic Jews, well, of course, they were very rich. Eventually, some of them, like Kadoorie, who had British citizenship, was in a prisoner of war camp, and which, from what I understand, was pretty tough. As a matter of fact, Horace Kadoorie came to one of our first Shanghai reunions in San Francisco. And, you know, we loved him because of the school and all the things he did for us.
Now, Jerry, how did your stepmother get from Shanghai to Louisiana after you left?
Well, they she had she had relatives in Monroe, Louisiana, who gave them an affidavit. I don't know how close the relatives were, and that's why they ended up in Monroe, Louisiana, in that small town there. But she left. They left much later than I did.
My understanding is that among the 18,000 Jewish refugees, almost everyone left in the couple years after the war. Is that?
Yes, and it's a good thing they did, because I think in 1949, the Cultural Revolution started, which was another complete disaster. You know, where all the intellectuals were sent out. Supposedly, very few, maybe a handful of refugees stayed during that time. But 99% of the people left, mostly to the United States, a lot of them to Australia and to Israel, and a few even went back to Germany because they were able to get a good pension.
So when you reunited with your stepmother in Louisiana, you mentioned that you experienced or you witnessed Jim Crow segregation. What was it like for you to see that after?
I mean, I couldn't believe it. I mean, the blacks were in the back of the bus. The separate bathrooms. I couldn't believe it. It was terrible. But they had a Jewish community there also, and they did quite well.
What was your? Here's a question about what was your reunion with your mom like in Bogota? You mentioned that you hadn't seen her in a long time, but she must have been overjoyed to see you and that you had made it.
Yes, well, she was overjoyed. But you know what, even in Germany, I had a nanny. Most people who were middle class, upper middle class, like we were, had a nanny. And I think I was closer to the nanny than to my mother, who was a bon vivant. And I was close to my mother, but never really as close as I was with Lily, my stepmother, who reared me. Even though I lived with them for 7 years.
There's another question here about languages. You speak German, English, Spanish.
And Spanish. I still speak Spanish practically every day.
Now, when you think about your memories of the war, are they in German because that was what you were speaking at the time?
If I think in German?
Yeah, the question is about what language feels most true for you when you're remembering your war years.
When I speak in German, I think in German. When I speak Spanish, I think in Spanish. And sometimes I get all three languages mixed up. When I think about the war years, well, it depends who I speak to. You know, I went back to Berlin, you know, twice. Once with my son when I went back to Blumen with him, and then I was invited also to go to Berlin once, and I spoke in that very large synagogue in Berlin, which was the only synagogue which was not burned down. The reason why it wasn't burned down because it was too close to some government buildings, and it still stands. They don't have services there, but I spoke there. Yeah.
Jerry, we had time for just 2 more questions. So let me ask you this one from an audience member. He said, what were your emotions like when you finally became a US citizen?
Well, I became a citizen automatically 5 years after I got here.
Mhm.
They sent me a note that I can become a citizen. And it wasn't like now, where it was very difficult. So I had to learn a few things about who was the first president, and I became a citizen. I was glad. I mean, it was a fairly common thing at that time. You know, it was automatic. I didn't have to do much. Became a citizen.
So the last question is this. Jerry, you are one of the last witnesses to Nazism. What is the most important thing that you want future generations to remember?
Well, you know, I give talks to high school students at your museums. I gave a lot of talks to non-Jewish kids and Jewish kids, just like I do at the 92nd Street Y and even at the Leo Baeck Institute. And I think it's very important for them to know what happened. We shall never forget, like a good friend of mine said, it has to be told. The story of Shanghai is not known. There's still many people who don't know it. And especially the kids nowadays should learn what happened, you know, in the war and the Holocaust.
Thank you so much, Jerry, for sharing your story with us and your reflections and your experiences. It's such a privilege for us to learn from you. So on behalf of the museum and the whole audience, thank you. To all of you watching, thank you for joining us. Jerry is a member of the museum's Speakers Bureau, and all of our work, including our Speakers Bureau, is made possible through audience support. So please consider making a donation to support the museum if you're able. We also hope you'll order Jerry's book, An Incredible Journey, to learn more about his story in detail. We will send a follow-up email out tomorrow that includes a recording of today's program, along with some book suggestions and other materials for further exploration.
Thank you, Ari.
Jerry, it was great to see you.
Thank goodbye to the audience, even though I can't see them.
Well, they can see you.
Yeah, they can see me. I cannot see anybody except you.
I hope everyone stays warm and healthy and has a great Sunday afternoon.
Okay, thank you very much. Bye.
Bye-bye.